exhaust the strength of the kingdom. In contrast to the empire's profession, all armed forces, the kingdom employed conscription. Therefore, every time the empire mobilized its troops, the kingdom would have no choice but to rally the masses in order to make up for the shortfall of individual quality in their troops. For that reason, the empire had embarked on a long-term plan. They declared war during the harvest season, forcing the kingdom to gather its peasants and have them take the field. As a result, the peasants lacked the manpower needed for a proper harvest, which in turn damaged the kingdom's agricultural output. Another reason for doing so was to weaken the strength of the nobles within the empire. The nation would levy a special war tax on nobles who opposed the emperor, making them cough up funds. If they refused to pay, they would be charged as traitors and stripped of their holdings. In the end, whether they were strangled to death or swiftly decapitated, the end came for them all the same. For these reasons, the emperor, Jerknev, believed that once the kingdom exhausted itself, the empire would not need to force itself to go to war. After all, the nobles within the empire were almost all toothless. However, one problem remained. Where had the wicked Jaldabaoth gone? What sort of being was he? It was all very disturbing. That was why he had ordered Flutter, the empire's top magic caster, to investigate Jaldabaoth. One could say it was only to be expected. Also, there's Darkness Mammon, who defeated Jaldabaoth, and his companion, beautiful Princess Nabe. Both of them are quite interesting. Then, there's the mysterious magic caster Ains Ulgaun. Have these hidden heroes finally decided to make their move? Perhaps there might be an intense battle, like the one against the demon gods 200 years ago. Will there be one? We don't know yet. However, only a fool would start preparing for it after it happened. The wise are always on watch against the future. Eventually, the carriage reached its destination. The sprawling grounds were encircled with thick, imposing walls, with watchtowers to keep an eye on both the inside and outside. Hand-picked knights from the First Legion, the most elite of the 8 Imperial Knight Legions, were mixed with a number of magic casters into several security teams, which were in charge of surveillance. When one looked to the sky, one could even see members of the Emperor's own bodyguard, the Royal Air Guard, mounted on flying beasts, as well as high-tier magic casters using flight magic as they stood on watch. This place was the symbol of the Empire's power, into which the previous Emperor had channeled the greater part of his efforts and energies, the Imperial Ministry of Magic. The production of magical equipment for the knights, the development of new spells, research into raising the standard of living through magical experiments, and so on. All of these could be said to be the essence of the Empire's magic, and they took place here. And the overall person in charge of this place, although the Ministry of Magic had no commanding officer, was Flutter. The carriage passed through the grounds, and finally stopped at a tower in the heart of the grounds. They had passed many strangely shaped buildings on the way here, and many people had come and gone from each building, but there was hardly any movement of people in and out of this tower. However, in contrast, the security around this tower was much stiffer than that around the other buildings. For starters, the knights here were dressed differently. They were not the same as the First Legion knights in other places. They were sheathed in suits of enchanted full-plate armor, carrying magic shields, and with magic weapons at their waists. Their crimson capes, which were embroidered with the emblem of the Empire, were also magic items, of course. While the enchantments on their gear were somewhat weak, ordinary knights could not wear such equipment, not even in the Empire. The most important thing was that ordinary knights would never be assigned to such a vital state institution. These ultra-elite knights were part of the Emperor's bodyguard, the Royal Earth Guard. The magic casters lined up here were no less impressive than the knights themselves. These experienced, valorous magic casters had the air of grizzled veterans around them. In addition, there were 4 stone golems, each over 2.5 meters tall, guarding the entrance. They did not sleep, and they did not rest, and they did not eat, eternally focused on their duty as guardians. The security around this facility was as heavy as that defending the Emperor's own body, and only elite magic casters, whose levels were in the upper reaches of the 3rd tier, or a very few research-oriented magic casters were permitted entry. Naturally, Flutter and his 2 disciples were permitted entry into this tower. The 3 of them raised their hands to acknowledge the knights and magic casters presenting arms to them, and then they entered the building. After walking through a straight passage, the 3 of them came to the upper level of a room shaped like a crucible. Many magic casters worked here. The highest ranked of them hurriedly ran up to Flutter. "Has there been any progress?" "Not at all, Master." The disciples gulped, and his Adam's apple shifted. The usual answer had 2 meanings, good and bad. Flutter simply nodded, with a complex expression on his face, and then turned to the 30 disciples he had personally tutored. They were particularly famous disciples, known as the Chosen 30, and faced one of them, who was the assistant supervisor of this building. "Is that so? You still haven't been able to induce a natural genesis, then?" "Indeed. Not even a skeleton, the least of all undead, has appeared so far. Currently, we are placing corpses beside it in the hope of inducing the creation of zombies." "MHM." Flutter stroked his long beard, and then looked down at the site beneath him. There were 10 odd skeletons there, and they were tilling a field. Each skeleton raised their hoe, then swung them down, in an identical manner to the one on either side of it. If one were to look at them from the side, their overlapping forms would seem like just a single skeleton. This highly coordinated spectacle, which vaguely resembled a form of group exercise, was the true identity of the large-scale project which the Empire had been conducting. In other words, it was undead labor. The undead did not need to eat, drink or sleep, and they did not tire. In other words, they were the perfect workers. Granted, low-tier undead were unintelligent, they could only listen to orders, and they could not perform complex tasks. However, that problem could be solved by having someone stand by to supervise them every step of the way. The merits of ordering the undead to carry out tasks in a crop field had exceeded their expectations. The reduction of manpower costs had reduced the prices of crops, expanded the farms and fields, eliminated the risk of human-related damage, and so on. It was truly a dream plan. There were other, similar plans, using summoned monsters and golems instead, but after taking all factors into consideration, the undead were still the most cost-effective choice. However, there was still a reason why such a seemingly perfect plan could not be put into practice on a large scale. That was because people opposed it, in particular, the factions led by the priests. They believed that creating undead, creatures of death which hated life, was an act which stained the soul. There were also problems from a religious perspective. They used the corpses of criminals to make undead, but the religious point of view was that a criminal's sin was paid off with the execution of their sentence. Going any further would be a form of blasphemy, and convincing them otherwise was a very difficult task. Perhaps they might be able to talk them round if the nation was facing a desperate food shortage, and many people were starving to death. However, the Empire's food stocks were ample, and they had no problems with manpower. For these reasons, the clergy opposed this plan. Ultimately, the true reason for this plan was to increase their military power. With the undead to handle production, they could divert their human resources elsewhere, potentially increasing the amount of talent for the Night Corps and other fields. In addition, once undead labor became widespread, there were people who were worried that human laborers would be made redundant. In addition, the undead would not listen to humanity forever, and large amounts of undead might upset the balance of life and death and lead to the spontaneous genesis of more powerful undead. It was not just the priests, but anyone who heard of the plan that was unsettled by it. The reason for this facility's existence was to address each of these concerns and find a solution to them. You haven't found the underlying reason yet? No, Master. My deepest apologies, Master. Why did the undead arise by themselves? Exploring this fundamental reason would have a decisive influence on the future. There was a place which was perpetually shrouded in a light mist that only lifted when the kingdom and the empire did battle. That place was a cursed land, known as the Katsa Plains. Undead appeared here at an alarmingly high rate, even skeletal dragons, some of the most powerful undead beings, who were immune to magic. Even if the Empire wanted to conquer the region around Irantal in the future, they did not want to have undead spawning land in their domain. Thus, discovering the process by which the undead arose would definitely be an aid to rulership. Perhaps they might even find a way to keep the undead from spawning ever again. Is that so? I understand. The assistant supervisor bowed, grateful to have been spared a rebuke. Flutter walked past him, going in one big circle around the crucible-shaped room. By the time Flutter reached the door on the other side, there were more disciples behind him. The knights guarding the door pushed it open, and the group passed through it. Behind the door was a passage like the one just now, but it was much colder than the outside, and there was nobody around. The scent of dust hung in the air, and the light was losing its battle with the darkness that pressed in on it. They walked along the corridor, and its dread-filled atmosphere, and soon they came to a spiral staircase that extended downwards. They passed through many doors in the process, and they did not spend much time going clack 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 down the spiral staircase. They were probably only 5 floors underground. Even so, the air was heavy, as though they were in a deeper place. This was not because they were underground. The best proof of that was that everyone, Flutter included, had a stiff expression on their faces. When they reached the bottom, an empty room, everyone had a grim set to their faces. They were visibly tense, perhaps even ready for battle. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the single, heavy door in the room. That door was filled with a sense of foreboding oppression, and it seemed to set this world apart from what lay beyond. In order to prevent its destruction, or easy opening, the door was reinforced with several layers of physical and magical protection. This was a door which would not permit escape. In addition, the many sturdy doors they had passed through on the way here spoke of the danger behind this final door. If the threat behind this door stirred, those door-shaped walls could buy some time. In other words, they were effectively a seal. Flutter issued a warning to his disciple in a tense voice. You must not be careless. It was a simple, terse statement, but that just made it all the more frightening. The magic casters accompanying him nodded deeply, as one. Flutter gave them the same warning every time they came here, but since they knew what lurked behind that door, their expressions had never once slacked off. That was because the ultimate undead was behind that door. If it was permitted to escape this place, it would spark a tragedy of unprecedented proportions in the imperial capital. Several people began casting protective spells. These spells did not just defend against physical threats, but also included spells which protected the mind. After giving them ample time to prepare, Flutter looked around at his disciples' faces, and saw that they were filled with determination. He nodded, and then uttered the keyword which would undo the seal. The heavy doors went tum, and by the power of magic, they slowly opened. Chilly air spilled out of the darkened room, and several of his disciples shivered, as though they were very cold. Even with magic items that allowed them to adapt to the environment, the hatred of the living which emanated from the depths of the room was enough to chill their soul. The sound of someone swallowing seemed particularly resonant here. Let's go. After hearing Flutter's words, his disciples created several magical lights to disperse the darkness of the room. Yet, for some reason, it felt like the darkness was thicker and heavier beyond the light it had fled. Led by Flutter, the group entered the room which was filled with the odor of death. It was a small room, so the magical lanterns soon illuminated the room's innermost reaches. There stood a gigantic pillar which reached the ceiling. This tombstone-like pillar certainly attracted attention. But what truly held the eye was the entity that was crucified to it with thick and heavy chains. Each link of the chains which bound it was much thicker than a grown man's thumb, rendering it completely immobile. The chains were secured to the stony floor of the room. In addition, its arms and legs were hobbled with gigantic iron balls. No entity could so much as move a finger under these conditions. This excessively harsh method of binding instead showed how wary they were of this entity. Therefore, whenever someone in the group looked on the thick chains, they still felt uneasy. They feared that this creature would easily snap the chains and regain its freedom. From the outside, it looked like a knight in black full-plate armor. However, there was a huge difference between it and a fully armored man. The first thing that caught the eye was its massive frame. Even a casual estimate of its height would put it above 2 meters in height. After that, there was its black full-plate armor. The armor was covered in tracery that looked like blood vessels, and studded with brutal-looking spikes. A pair of demonic-looking horns sprouted from its helmet, and it exposed the face, which was a rotten human visage. 2 crimson points of light shone from within the empty orbits of its eye sockets, formed of hatred for the living, and a longing for massacre. It was not a living being, but one of the dead. Otherwise, it could not radiate such an intense hatred for the living. Death Knight. One of the disciples, who had come here for the first time, spoke the name of the legendary undead creature. Since it was a being of legends, it was not particularly well known. The red points of light within the Death Knight's eyes moved, sizing up all the magic casters like it was licking them with its gaze. No, they could not possibly see any movement from within those dancing masses of light. However, the spine-chilling terror made them feel that the Death Knight was looking right at them. The people who came here were almighty individuals in their own right, each capable of casting third-tier spells at a minimum. Yet, even they could not stop the chattering of their teeth. Despite their spells to protect their minds, they could not stop the fear welling up from within them. Yet, the reason why they had pulled themselves together, and not fled was probably because of their magical protections. Be strong. The weak-willed will perish. After issuing his warning, Flutter approached the Death Knight. The Death Knight reacted to him. It radiated killing intent, and began flexing its limbs. The chains groaned as the Death Knight struggled and pulled its bonds taut, and its body quivered. Flutter extended his hand straight at the Death Knight. His incantation reverberated through the darkened room, lit by magical light. This was a modified version of Summon Undead 6th, an original spell penned by Flutter. Obey me. The spell took effect, Flutter's quiet words flowed out and filled the room. However, the Death Knight's eyes were still filled with hatred for the living. Everyone knew the spell had failed. So I still can't control it, even now? There was a hint of regret within Flutter's voice. That was because he had tried to control this undead creature for the past 5 years, without success. They had discovered this monster in that place known for being haunted by the undead, the Katsa Plains. The squad of Imperial Knights who had first encountered this monster had never seen it before, but they were under orders, so they attacked it as per standard procedure. Several seconds later, they realized how rash and foolish they had been. The faces of those Imperial Knights, known by all for their skill and bravery, were filled with fear and despair. They had been utterly and one-sidedly overwhelmed, their opposition was far too strong. After their foe mowed down countless knights like the passing of a violent gale, they finally realized that there was nothing they could do against it, and began to retreat. Of course, they could not just leave such a monster be, especially after personally witnessing the murdered knights become undead beings, serving the monster as its minions. Clearly, the more time they gave their opponent, the worse the situation would become. After intensive debate among the Empire's leadership, they decided to open with their trump card, the most powerful fighting force in the Empire, which was to say they would mobilize Flutter and his adept disciples. And so, the Death Knight had been captured and imprisoned here, which was to say that the battle had ended with Flutter and company victorious. However, the reason why Flutter and the others had won was simply because the Death Knight had no way to fly. They launched a sustained area attack on it that was no different from carpet bombing, a repeated barrage of fireballs from the air, which slowed the Death Knight's movements, and in the end Flutter, who had been mesmerized by its overwhelming power, had captured it intact. Currently, Flutter had imprisoned it here and gone through countless spells, countless magic items, and countless means, searching through all the means which could control an undead being in order to control the Death Knight. What a shame! If only I could control this monster, I'd be able to surpass that magic caster, and become the greatest magic caster. If he succeeded, he would be far superior to the necromancer of the 13 heroes, Rigrit Bear's Karau. In truth, Flutter was not particularly interested in strength. His true ambition lay in peering into the abyss. This was just a step along that road. His disciples did not understand that, and so they began spouting misplaced consolation instead. Master, you've long since exceeded that hero. Exactly. The 13 heroes are beings from the past. There's no way they can beat our master, who stands at the pinnacle of modern magic. I also feel that Master has long since surpassed the 13 heroes. However, if Master could take control of the Death Knight, the Empire would possess a source of incredible power. It's often said that an individual can't defeat a group, but that's just because the individual's too weak. That Death Knight is the most powerful individual around. Flutter was standing at the head of the group, so none of them saw him smile bitterly to himself. Only the hate-filled eyes of the Death Knight saw it. Still, if even Master cannot take control of it, then how powerful is that Death Knight, anyway? That, who knows? Theoretically speaking, it should be controllable. What are we missing? Does anyone have any ideas? The group's answer to that was silence. The undead could be controlled through magic, and one of the 13 heroes had done just that. Flutter's power was such that he could control undead beings of quite a high level. Perhaps he could even take control of the Death Knight before his eyes. However, that was simply theoretical. Actually controlling an undead being with magic involved more complex mechanisms. Fundamentally speaking, controlling or destroying the undead was the domain of the priests, who borrowed the power of the gods. Magic casters used arcane power to emulate divine might, so various discrepancies were only to be expected. It's not my intention to insult you, Master, but one of his disciples began cautiously with that, and Flutter bade him continue speaking. Could it be you're simply not strong enough, Master? If magic of the 7th tier exists, then perhaps the Death Knight might require undead summoning magic of that level in order to command it. That is a good observation. I've heard that the Adventurers Guild often summarizes the data of various monsters, and converts them into a difficulty rating. Perhaps that line of thought is worth pursuing? I've heard those values are very crude, and are essentially meaningless due to changes in body and age, another disciple said. Still, other than unknown monsters, there's no metric which is easier to understand. After all, those values are based on combat feedback from adventurers and other forms of data. It can't be completely inaccurate. Going by what you said, you still can't use it on a legendary class monster like the Death Knight. Ah yes, Master. Does that secret tome which records all manner of monsters mention that particular monster? No, Flutter said while stroking his beard. Perhaps the complete version of the airy wench might, but the only copies circulating in the outside world are not complete. One of his disciples seemed to have a question, which he addressed to a disciple next to him. While his voice was very soft, the room was the very embodiment of silence, and so his words seemed surprisingly loud. What's the airy wenchu? Isn't it the name of a city? I know that, but it sounds really weird. I looked it up once. I think it's a word from an ancient language which means, the great tree at the heart of the world. Flutter rapped the floor with his staff, as a warning to his chatting disciples. This was a dangerous place which incarcerated a legendary class monster. Carelessness was strictly forbidden. His disciples heeded the warning, and the master of the chamber, silence, ruled it once more, aside from the sounds of the Death Knight struggling against its chains in an attempt to break them. What a shame. There's no need for us to stay here any longer. Let's go. Yes. After hearing the chorus of relieved replies, Flutter strode away from the Death Knight with big steps. Even someone like Flutter could not maintain the same pace leaving the room as he had when entering it. His steps quickened as he felt the Death Knight's vicious glare burning into his back. In that respect, his disciples were the same as him. As Flutter walked through the darkness, he recalled the word his disciples had mentioned just now. Eriwenshu. It was the capital of the kingdom founded by the 8 Greed Kings, and also its sole surviving city. At the same time, it was also a city defended by 30 city guardians equipped with magical arms and armor that surpassed conventional reason. It was said that there were magic items left behind by the 8 Greed Kings there, and with them, he would surely be able to vastly improve his own magical skills. Flutter thought. These incredible items had never fallen into anyone's hands, and only the 13 heroes had been allowed to take several pieces away. A black flame flickered in Flutter's heart. The 13 heroes, heroes of the past. Flutter's might ought to have been the equivalent of theirs, but only they had been granted that permission, while he had not. In what way did he not measure up to them? Flutter tried to put out the wavering fire in his heart, thinking of other things to reassure himself. His present position, and all the things he had built, were no less than what the 13 heroes had done. No, among the Empire's magic casters, Flutter's status was greater even than the 13 heroes. However, once that the black fire, the flame of jealousy, blazed up, it could not be easily extinguished, because what he envied was not their power, their knowledge, or their abilities, but rather the fact that they had obtained a chance to peer into the abyss of magic. Flutter was a magic caster of the highest order, nobody would dispute that. The only people who could compare to him were the 13 heroes of the past. However, he could not control the Death Knight, and of the 10 tiers of magic that were said to exist, although the reliability of that information was a little low, he could only cast spells of up to the 6th tier. This situation was a stark reminder that he was far from the abyss of magic. Flutter was old. Among the sage arts he had learned as a spiritual magic caster was a certain branch known as the Forbidden Arts. He had used this forbidden magic to stop his aging. Of course, given the level of magic Flutter had mastered, using that spell was very difficult. In the end, he had barely managed to cast it with a ritual spell. However, since this was a twisting of the impossible into the possible, it had been distorted. The spell which should have granted immortality if perfectly cast instead allowed Flutter to experience, ever so slightly, the passage of time. He could still handle it now. However, the distortion would grow larger, and eventually there would be a weakness in it. Indeed. Flutter would die before he could gaze into the abyss of magic. Perhaps if a skilled predecessor had guided him, he might have been able to reach his current position sooner. However, there had been nobody ahead of him, so all he could do was blaze his own trail. Flutter nonchalantly looked at the disciples around him. He looked around at the people who walked along the trail Flutter had blazed. It was fuel to the fire of his jealousy, which blazed even more fiercely. He, as the most knowledgeable person present, how old had he been when he had been at his disciples' level? No, there was no need to think about it. He would surely have been older than his disciples were. That was how great the difference was without anybody to guide him, without anybody to show him the way. Why did he not have a master of his own? Flutter tried to think in a different direction to mask the complaints he often had. It was fine, right? He would go down in history as a forerunner. Every single magic caster would give thanks to Flutter for the results he had left behind, which were derived from the trail he had blazed. These pupils are my treasure. So long as any of them reaches a greater height than myself, it will be a part of my accomplishments too. Flutter thought of one of his disciples while consoling himself. That disciple had long since departed his side. What tier could that girl have reached? Archie E.B. Rylefert. She was an excellent girl. She had mastered the 2nd tier of magic at a young age, and even begun her first steps upon the 3rd. So long as she continued training, she might well have been able to reach Flutter's domain. But regretfully, at the end, she had abandoned her studies for some reason. Flutter had been utterly disappointed back then. All they could think of was that she had been terribly foolish. What a shame. Perhaps she had been the one that got away. Where was that girl now? Flutter thought, perhaps I could try and find her. If she can use magic of the 3rd tier, perhaps I could give her a good position. That said, there were still things which had to be done. Flutter incanted the command word, and opened the heavy door. After that, he exited the room, and took several deep breaths with his disciples. That was because the air in the Death Knight's room was heavy with the stench of its presence, and it felt like the air would not enter their lungs. Master. A low, coarse voice called out to him. There stood one of his adept disciples, who was also a famous male adventurer. Due to the breadth of his experience, he was the second in command of the Ministry of Magic's security forces. What happened? Is there an emergency? No, not an emergency. 2 adamantine